Bounded by Duke Street, Upper Parliament Street, Hope Street and St James Mount in Liverpool city centre, next to Chinatown and walking distance from Metropolitan Cathedral. There's two Grade 1 listed landmarks at Liverpool next to a sunken garden. This splendid but eerie St James Garden was previously a cemetery which opened in 1829. It covers approximately 10 acres. It's a quarter of a mile long and 100 feet deep. The place began life over 400 years ago as a sandstone quarry, which provided stone for the Old Dock and many of Liverpool's famous buildings, including the Town Hall. But Liverpool had only one public cemetery at the time, on the corner of Everton Road and West Derby Road. So around 1825, when the quarry became exhausted, it was decided to turn it into a cemetery for Liverpool's growing population. Liverpool's Anglican community formed a joint stock company and shares were sold to raise the funds. Liverpool Corporation contributed the land and eminent Liverpool architect John Foster Jr. was tasked with designing the cemetery. Foster was aided by John Shepherd, the designer of the Botanic Gardens in Wavertree, as landscaper. Construction of the cemetery began in 1827 and opened 2 years later in 1829, costing £21,000, a huge sum of money nowadays. The cemetery has a natural spring and the Huskisson Memorial, dedicated to popular politician William Huskisson, who was killed during the opening of Wales' first passenger railway, the Liverpool-Manchester Railway in 1830, making Huskisson the first person in the world to be killed by a train. A chapel was built where once the quarry's windmill had been located. Known as the Oratory, it was built with stone and no windows. The only source of light is the space in the roof. It opened at the same time as the cemetery and by the same architects, John Foster Jr., in Greek Revival style. The chapel is now only open by appointment only.
Over 57,000 buried here, including some of my ancestors and John Foster Jr. himself.
There's sailors, orphans, city leaders are buried here, and it's a bit crazy to think that the guy who actually designed the cemetery, he himself is buried here. The last burial took place in 1936, over 100 years after the cemetery first opened. Later, after years of abandonment, it was decided to convert the cemetery into a garden cemetery, and in 1972 the St James Garden was born.
The gardens are open all the year round, it's free to enter, and the thing I like about it is that it was my childhood playground.
Was it? Okay, cool. I didn't know that. For me, one of the things I like about this place is that it's not as sentimental as one of your normal cemetery. But I gotta be honest, I find this place quite eerie. I mean, it's quite cold. There's a silent eerie feel to it because of the fact that you're standing on top of all these graves. But it is spectacular. And knowing that you have a sunken garden in the heart of city centre, it's a cool thing.
Overlooking St James's Gardens and dominating the skyline is this Grade 1 listed building's Liverpool Cathedral.
It's the largest cathedral in Britain and the 5th largest in the world. It was designed by 22-year-old Sir Giles Gilbert Scott from London, who also designed the iconic red telephone box. Construction of the Liverpool Cathedral began in 1904 and completed 74 years later in 1978, though the cathedral was consecrated in 1924. The cathedral was the vision of the second Bishop of Liverpool, Dr. Francis James Shavas, who noticed Liverpool did not have a cathedral at the time. It was funded by all sorts of people, including children. Money from demolishment of nearby St. Peter's Church also went towards the Anglican Cathedral. The foundation stone was laid by King Edward VII, and the minister's house that was originally built here was demolished to make way for cathedral. The sandstone used to make the cathedral came from the local Woolton quarry just a few miles away. Initially, George Frederick Bodley was allocated as joint architect to help Giles Gilbert Scott, as Giles was considered young. But Bodley passed away 4 years later, so Scott became the sole architect. He modified his original design to have one tower rather than two, so there was less pillars now and more worshippers could fit in and the pillars wouldn't obstruct the view. In 1924, Liverpool Cathedral was consecrated in presence of King George V and Queen Mary. 4 years later, Dr. Shavas had passed away and is buried outside the cathedral on a spot known as Founder's Plot. In 1960, Sir Giles also passed away and is buried in the opposite end of the cathedral, a few meters front of the great door. His wife, a Scouser, is also buried here. 18 years after Sir Giles' death, on 25th of October 1978, the cathedral was finally complete and opened by Queen Elizabeth II with great fanfare. It has a capacity to hold around 2,000 worshippers and is one of the biggest in Christendom. It remained faithful to Scots design, though nobody knows exactly how much it cost to build. Today, the cathedral is free to enter, but there is a charge if you want to go to the top of the 100-meter high tower and get panorama of the city. It receives no government funding or subsidy and is maintained by private and public donations and events which takes place throughout the year. You can also hire the cathedral for weddings, christening, funerals and university graduation ceremonies. There's also a cafe inside the cathedral. Liverpool Cathedral is a high-ranking tourist attraction and is pivotal to the spiritual and worship life of the city.